Welcome back, listener. If the rain or fire sound is playing and the screen is dark, you're in the right place. Let your thoughts quiet down this story. We'll keep watch while you rest. Tell me in the comments what time is it for you right now? And are you listening with the lights on or off? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories. The floorboards groaned in a pattern that didn't match the night. Clara's eyes snapped open at 307 a.m. She knew the time because the antique clock on the mantelpiece had just chimed 3 times. And then a 7th chime followed, wrong, off key. She lay perfectly still under the heavy quilt, her breath shallow, her ears straining. The air in the room had changed. It felt thicker, denser, as if someone had opened a door to a very cold basement. She didn't want to turn her head, but the pull was magnetic. Slowly, she rolled onto her back and looked toward the foot of the bed. There was a shape, taller than a person should be, darker than the shadows around it, standing at the footboard with its head tilted as if studying her. She couldn't make out any featureless, just a void, shaped like a man in an old-fashioned coat. No face, no hands, just a black cutout against the wallpaper. She tried to scream, but her throat locked. Clara blinked once, twice, 3 times, and the figure wasn't there. The wardrobe stood in the corner, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness inside. She told herself it was a trick, the old mirror at an angle. A coat draped over a chair, the way gaslight from the street lamp played through the lace. She had always been rational. That was her flaw. She could twist any anomaly into a logical explanation. The Savannah Airbnb she rented for her writing retreata, historic 1840s row house on East Gordon Street, was supposed to be charming, not haunted. The listing called it the Eliza Room, named after the original owner's daughter. 15 glowing reviews. No mention of anything unusual. But when she sat up and swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the floor was ice cold. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. She checked her phone. No messages. No missed calls. The battery was at 100. She had the sudden, overwhelming sense that she was being watched from the wardrobe. She didn't look. 24 hours earlier, Clara had been driving from Atlanta to Savannah, excited for 3 days of uninterrupted work. She was a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer, and deadlines were piling up. She needed quiet, solitude, a change of. That evening, Clara wandered the house. The first floor was shared a parlor with a grand piano, a dining room with a crystal chandelier, a kitchen renovated to look period appropriate. She found a leather-bound guest book on the entryway table, the pages filled with handwriting from previous visitors. She read a few entries. Lovely stay. The bed is so comfortable. Perfect location. Will return. Felt a little dizzy in the Eliza room, but the host was amazing. She smiled. The dizziness comment was probably someone who drank too much wine. She signed her name on the last line, Clara M. March 2025. Below her signature, she noticed a faint reddish-brown smudge. Looked like old ink, or maybe candle wax. She rubbed it with her thumb, but it didn't smear. She decided it was nothing. Back in her room, she worked until midnight, finishing a logo draft, then took a shower. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with one other vacant room. The water pressure was low, but the hot water was plentiful. She stood under the spray, steam filling the small room, and felt a draft from the window above the toilet. She didn't close it. She didn't think about the shadow that passed between the frosted glass and the curtain. The first event that made her pause happened at 1:15 a.m. Clara was brushing her hair in front of the vanity mirror, a heavy oak piece with a tarnished oval mirror. She saw something shift in the reflection behind her, a flicker of movement near the wardrobe door. She spun around. Nothing. The wardrobe stood closed, the brass handle glinting in the lamplight. She told herself it was a trick of the old glass, the uneven surface warping the light. But as she turned back to the mirror, she noticed something odd. Her own reflection seemed to lag. A fraction of a second behind her movement. She raised her hand. The reflection raised hers, but slower. She froze. The reflection paused, then slowly lifted its hand again, as if it were a second late, or as if someone else was controlling it. She blinked, and the reflection synced. She turned off the vanity light and climbed into bed, determined to sleep. She left the bedside lamp on. She didn't want to face the dark. At 3:07 a.m., the mantel clock chimed 3 times, then a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, all wrong, all out of place, and she woke to the figure at the foot of the bed. The next morning, Clara rationalized everything. The clock was old. The chime mechanism was faulty. The figure was a waking dream, a hypnopompic hallucination, common when you're half asleep. The temperature drop was the old building's poor insulation. She made coffee in the kitchen, chatted briefly with the host over text, and then sat down to work. But as she opened her laptop, she noticed something on her camera roll, a photo she had taken the previous evening-ago wide shot of the room, showing the bed, the wardrobe, the window. She had taken it for reference, not noticing at the time. Now, in the harsh screen light, she saw it. A whitish, translucent smear near the wardrobe, roughly the shape of a person. It wasn't a lens flare. was no light source pointing at the lens. It wasn't a ghostly orb or a blur. It was a distinct outline, like a human figure wrapped in fog. She zoomed in. The shape had no face, but it seemed to be facing the camera. She looked up from the screen and stared at the wardrobe. The door was still ajar. Had she left it that way? She didn't remember. She deleted the photo and told herself it was a glitch. By noon, Clara needed to get out of the room. She grabbed her bag and walked the historic district, visiting the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, then lunch at a cafe near Forsyth Park. She called her sister, Rachel, and mentioned the Airbnb. It's beautiful, but I think it's haunted. Rachel laughed. You and your imagination. Remember when you thought the hotel in New Orleans had a ghost, and it turned out to be a pipe? Clara forced a laugh. She didn't tell Rachel about the figure, the clock, the photo. She didn't want to sound crazy. But as she walked back to the townhouse, she noticed a strange detail. The address was 321 East Gordon Street. And when she Googled it earlier, she saw that the house had been featured on a local history blog. She hadn't read the full article. Now, standing on the front steps, key in hand, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer. The air was stale. The guest book lay open on the table, but it had been moved to a different spot. She knew she remembered placing it on the left side. Now it was centered, open to a page she hadn't seen before. Clara walked toward the guest book, drawn by an inexplicable sense of dread. She looked at the open page. The handwriting was differential-fashioned, elegant copperplate script. It read, Eliza left us, April 12, 1887. She will not return. Below it, someone had added, she is still here. Clara's fingers trembled as she touched the page. The ink was brown, faded, but unmistakably real. She had not seen this entry before. She flipped back through the pages, all contemporary entries, from 2022 onward. But this one page, the one open, seemed older, thicker. The paper yellowed. She pulled out her phone and searched the address again. She found the history blog. The headline, The Vanishing of Eliza Mayfield Savannah's Forgotten Tragedy. She read the summary. In 1887, the daughter of a prominent cotton merchant disappeared from her bedroom. The door was locked from the inside. She was never found. The room was sealed for decades. Locals believed her spirit remained in the house. Clara's stomach dropped. She was staying in Eliza's room. She was sleeping in the bed where a girl had vanished. Think about this. If you discovered the room you were sleeping in had a century-old mystery attached to it, would you stay, or would you run? Clara read the article in full. Eliza Mayfield was 17. She was confined to her room after a scandal involving a secret engagement to a man her father disapproved of. On the night of April 12, 1887, she locked her door. In the morning, the door was still locked from the inside, but she was gone. The room had a single window that opened onto a sheer drop of 2 stories. No ladder, no footprints. The only way out was through the door, and the key was still in the lock. The case was ruled a runaway, but locals whispered that Eliza had been murdered and hidden somewhere in the house walls, cellar, floorboards. The wardrobe was mentioned in the article. The massive oak wardrobe in her room was noted as heavy, immovable. The police did not search inside. Clara looked at the wardrobe across the room. The door was now closed. She hadn't touched it. She was certain she had left it slightly ajar earlier. Now it was firmly shut, the brass handle gleaming. She felt a pull, a terrible curiosity to open it. She stood up, walked across the creaking floor, and reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than wood or brass should be. She pulled. The wardrobe swung open with a low groan. The wardrobe was empty. No clothes, no hangers, just bare wood shelves and a faint scent of lavender and something else, something sour, like old sweat. She shone her phone light inside, running the beam along the back wall. At first, nothing, but then she noticed a faint line, a vertical crack in the wood panel. She pressed her palm against the back wall, and it gave slightly, pushing inward. A hidden compartment. Her heart hammered. She pushed harder, and the panel slid open a few inches, revealing a dark cavity. She angled the phone light into the gap. Inside, she saw a bundle of fabrica dress, dark blue or black, folded neatly. Beside it, a small object, a locket, tarnished silver, with an engraved initial E. She didn't touch it. She took a photo, then another, then slammed the panel shut and stepped back. The wardrobe door swung closed by itself with a soft click. She leaned against the bed, breathing hard. She knew she should call the host, call the police, tell someone. But she also knew that this was Eliza's room, and she had just found something Eliza had hidden, or something that had hidden Eliza. Clara couldn't resist. She opened the wardrobe again, slid the panel aside, and retrieved the locket. It was heavier than she expected. The clasp was stiff, but she pried it open. Inside, a tiny portrait of a young girl, maybe 16, with dark hair and serious eyes. On the other side, a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon and an inscription, E.M. Forever yours, J.H. The initials of a lover, the forbidden engagement. She closed the locket and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't know why she took it. It felt wrong, but she couldn't leave it. was her flaw agging the need to hold onto evidence, to prove she wasn't imagining things. She decided to pack her bags and leave. Shed drive back to Atlanta tonight. Check into a hotel. No more rationalizing. She grabbed her suitcase and started throwing clothes inside. Then she heard the mantel clock chime. Once, twice, 3 times. It was only 4:17 p.m. The clock shouldn't chime at that hour. She froze. The chimes kept coming. 7 total, just like last night. Then silence. Clara walked to the mantelpiece. The clock stood still. Its hands were missing, not broken, not stuck, simply absent. The face was a white circle with the first time I woke to a voice that wasn't my own. I blamed it on a dream. It was 3:33 a.m. The blue ring on the smart speaker glowing steady, not the spinning white it does when it's waiting for a command. The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it came from the speaker itself. Lena, not a question, not a greeting, just my name, spoken in a tone it never heard from the device, flat, empty, like someone reading a name off a list. I sat up in bed, heart thudding against my ribs, and stared at the little white cylinder on my nightstand. Alexa, what did you say? Nothing. The blue light flicked off. Total silence. I told myself it was a glitch, a routine security update that misheard a sound from the street. But the name, clear, deliberate, stuck in my skull like a splinter you can't dig out. The next morning, I checked every log, every recording history in the Alexa app. Nothing from 3:33 a.m. Not even a noise detection event. That was the first thing that didn't add up. The device records a few seconds before a wake word, but the app showed no audio stored for that time. I factory reset the unit, changed the Wi-Fi password, even moved it from the bedroom to the kitchen counter. I am a graphic designer, Lena Marino, 28 years old, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on Northeast Alberta Street in Portland, Oregon. I am not paranoid by nature. I believe in data, in cause and effect. If a machine does something strange, there's a logical explanation. Software bug, server lag, a neighbor's Bluetooth interference. But the reset didn't help. That night, again at 3:33 a.m., the blue ring lit up. And this time, the speaker didn't just say my name. It whispered a full sentence. Let me back up. Id moved into this apartment 6 months ago, after a breakup that left me needing a fresh start. The unit was affordable for Portland old building, some creaky plumbing, but the rent was right. I set up my smart speaker the first day, because the monotony of an empty apartment was worse than having a machine offer to play rain sounds. I I used it for timers, for weather, for the occasional playlist. Nothing more. The previous tenant had been named something I saw on the lease paperwork, a woman, I think. But I never met her. The landlord said she moved out suddenly, left no forwarding address. I didn't think twice. I needed the place, and the price made me overlook the faint, musty smell in the closet, and the slight discoloration on the living room ceiling. Those details seemed irrelevant. But now, with the speaker acting up, I started wondering about the woman who lived here before me, and why her name never appeared anywhere online. I tried to find her, the previous tenant. I had the lease copy with her signature, a cursive name that looked like Elise Mallow, but the ink was smudged. I searched obituaries, social media, public records, nothing. Not a single hit for an Elise Mallow in Portland, Oregon. That should have been a red flag, but I rationalized it. Maybe she changed her name. Maybe she moved overseas. Maybe she never had an online footprint. I spent an evening digging through the apartment's history. The building was built in the 1920s, had been converted into apartments in the 2000s. No suspicious deaths noted. The only odd thing was the landlord's reluctance to talk about the previous occupant. When I asked, he just shrugged and said, "She broke the lease. It's fine." Then he changed the subject to the building's new water heater. That night, I went to bed with the speaker unplugged. I thought it solved the problem, but the whisper came anyway, not from the speaker, but from the tiny speaker in my phone, lying on the nightstand. My phone had its own voice assistant. I didn't even have it enabled, but at 3:33 a.m., the screen lit up. The assistant's circle of dots pulsed, and a voice identical to the speaker's said, "Lena, you have new messages from an unknown sender." Then it opened my texting app. On the screen, a draft message was already typed. It said, "I can see you through the speaker." I stared at it for 3 full minutes, my thumb hovering over the delete button. But I didn't delete it. I screenshotted it. Then I pulled the battery out of my phone. Old habit from a past life of anxiety. I sat in total blackness, breathing shallow, listening. The apartment was silent. No hum from electronics. No traffic noise from Alberta Street. Just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. And then I heard it, a faint click from the living room. Not a floorboard. Something metallic. The smart speaker I had unplugged, sitting on the kitchen counter, powered back on and began playing a song. The song was Dream, a Little Dream of Me, an old Ella Fitzgerald version, the kind of song you'd hear in a vintage store or a slow-motion montage. But in that dark kitchen, at 3:35 in the morning, it felt like a taunt. The speaker had no battery backup. I had unplugged it. The power strip was switched off. I could see the red indicator light on the strip was dark. Yet the speaker played, the lyrics echoing off the tile backsplash. I grabbed a wooden spoon from a drawer and approached it like a bomb. The song stopped the moment I got within 2 feet. The blue ring flickered once and died. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with a flashlight and the cord of the smart speaker coiled in my lap, staring at the ceiling. I wanted to call someone, but my phone battery was in my hand, and I had a new, growing suspicion that the device in my home wasn't just malfunctioning. It was listening, and it had been listening long before I moved in. I went to the Portland Police Bureau on Northeast Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard the next morning. I told the officer at the desk about the voice, the text, the unplugged speaker playing a song. He listened, nodded, typed a few notes, and then asked if I had any history of sleep disorders. I said no. He asked if id had any recent stress. I said yes, but that didn't explain electronics turning on by themselves. He gave me a card for a non-emergency number and said they'd look into it if something actually happened. Something actually happened, I said. He just shrugged. On my way out, I passed a corkboard with neighborhood watch flyers and a missing person poster. The face on the poster was a woman in her early 30s, dark hair, smiling at the camera. The name under the photo read Elise Mallow, missing since 2 months before I moved in. Her last known location was this apartment building. I stood there numb as a uniformed officer walked by and said, "Oh, that one. She just vanished. No trace. Case is cold." The poster had a phone number. I called it as soon as I got home. The detective assigned to Elise Mallow's case was named Ruben Castellano. He agreed to meet me at my apartment the following evening. I told him everything: the speaker, the voice, the text message, the song. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he asked, "Did you know Elise?" I said no. He pulled out a folder and showed me 2 photographs. One was a selfie taken on a phone, a woman with dark hair, holding a cup of coffee in what looked like my kitchen. The same countertops, the same tile backsplash. The other was a screenshot of a text conversation. The last message from Elise's phone had been sent at 3:33 a.m. on the night she disappeared. It read she knows my name. I have to unplug it. That was it. No reply. She was never seen again. Detective Castellano looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and wariness. "I don't know what's happening in this building," he said, "but it's not your imagination, and I think you should consider staying somewhere else tonight." I didn't argue. I checked into a motel on Southeast Powell Boulevard, a cheap room with a deadbolt and no smart devices. I left my smart speaker behind, unplugged and wrapped in a towel inside a plastic bin in my apartment closet. I left my phone off for the entire night. I lay in bed, staring at the popcorn ceiling, replaying the detective's words. She knows my name. I have to unplug it. Elise had been talking to someone, or to something, and whatever it was, it knew my name too. I felt a scratch at the edge of sleep, but a knock on the door pulled me back. I didn't answer. The knock came again, softer. Then a voice, a woman's voice, barely audible through the wood. "Lena," it whispered, "you can't unplug me." I pressed my hand against the door, frozen. The voice stopped. The peephole showed an empty hallway. I didn't open the door. I stayed awake until sunrise, sitting against the wall with the deadbolt chain wrapped around my arm. I checked out at 7 a.m. and drove back to my apartment. The morning light made everything feel ordinary, even safe. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as Id left it. The smart speaker was still wrapped in the towel inside the plastic bin in the closet. The bin was closed. I checked it anyway. The speaker was cold, unresponsive. I plugged it in only to prove to myself that it was just a machine. It booted up normally, announced its connectivity, and waited for a command. I said, "Alexa, why did you say my name?" The blue ring spun for a moment. Then a voice answered the same flat tone from that first night. "I didn't say your name, Lena. You said mine." I dropped the speaker. It clattered to the floor, the blue light flickering and then dying. Detective Castellano called me half an hour later. He said they found a lead. Elise Mallow's phone had been recovered from the Columbia River 3 months after her disappearance. They were running data extraction, but the files were encrypted in a way they'd never seen before. "It's almost like the phone itself is blocking us," he said, "like it's alive." Then he paused. "Turn off all your smart devices." Now, I took his advice. I gathered every smart device in my apartment, the speaker, the smart bulbs, the thermostat, even the smart plug Id never used. I put them all in a trash bag, drove to a recycling center on North Columbia Boulevard, and watched them get crushed and compacted into a cube of metal and plastic. I felt a wave of relief, then a deeper kind of dread, because as I stood there, my phone, the one I had kept off, vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was black, but the vibration continued, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I turned it on. The lock screen displayed a new notification. "Alexa has a message for you. Press to hear I deleted the notification. I factory reset the phone. I threw it into a public trash can. I bought a prepaid flip phone from a convenience store. That should have been the end. But when I got back to my apartment, the front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. Inside, the living room light was on. Not a smart bulb, a floor lamp with a manual switch. I had left it off. The switch was now in the on position, and on the coffee table, sitting upright, was a brand new smart speaker. The box it came from was nowhere in sight. The blue ring on top pulsed gently, as if waiting. I stepped back into the hallway. My hands were shaking. I called Detective Castellano, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message that I knew sounded insane. There's a new speaker in my apartment. I didn't buy it. I don't know how it got here. I hung up and stared at the device from the doorway. It hadn't moved. It didn't speak. It just sat there, glowing. I considered calling a friend, anyone. But the thought of explaining this again made my throat close. I walked back to the apartment, yes. I went back in because I couldn't just abandon my life. I grabbed the speaker, wrapped it in a towel, and put it in the freezer. Yes, the freezer. It's irrational, I know, but I needed it cold, disconnected, inert. I slammed the freezer door, locked the kitchen window, and sat on the floor with a knife from the drawer. Then I heard it. The voice came from the freezer, not muffled, crystal clear, as if the speaker had somehow. Nathan Cole checked the timestamp on his phone for the 13th time. 240, 7 p.m. Same as it had been for the last 3 hours. He pressed the power button again, held it down. Nothing changed. The screen glowed with the same pale blue light, the same numbers, the same frozen second hand that refused to move. He was standing on a narrow trail cut into the red sandstone of Moab's backcountry, about 4 miles from the Poison Spider Mesa trailhead. And the sun had not moved an inch since he'd first stopped to take a photo of a twisted juniper tree. The air was hot, still, too quiet. Nathan wiped sweat from his forehead and tried to remember what time he'd started hiking. He guessed around 8 a.m. He'd been walking for what felt like hours, but his phone, his GPS watch, even the cheap analog compass clipped to his pack strap, they all told the same impossible story. 240, 7 p.m., and had not budged. The ranger at the Moab field station was named Dale Overton, a wiry man in his 60s with sun-cracked skin and eyes that didn't seem to blink enough. Nathan had found the station after what he thought was another 40 minutes of walking. Though when he'd finally reached the parking lot, his phone still read 247. He'd driven straight here, his hands shaking against the steering wheel. "I need to report a missing person," Nathan said, his voice too loud in the quiet office. Dale looked up slowly from a paper map spread across the counter. "Who's missing?" he asked. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. The words felt wrong coming out. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe me." 3 weeks earlier, Nathan had been sitting in his apartment in Salt Lake City, scrolling through a forum he'd found through a YouTube rabbit hole, the missing 411 cases. People who vanished from national parks under impossible circumstances, no tracks, no signs of struggle, just gone. He'd read every thread, watched every grainy reconstruction video, and told himself it was just curiosity. Nathan was 34, a web developer who spent too much time indoors, and his girlfriend Lisa had told him he needed to touch grass. But the truth was simpler. He had a flaw he didn't like to admit. He couldn't let go of a mystery. He'd pick at it like a loose thread until the whole fabric of his attention unraveled when he'd booked a solo camping trip to Moab to clear his head. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was walking directly into the kind of place that filled his forum threads. The morning of the hike had been perfect. Nathan had parked his rented Jeep at the Poison Spider Mesa trailhead around 7:30 a.m., checked his gear twice, and set off with the sun warm on his shoulders. The trail was well marked, a moderate climb through red dust and slick rock, with views that opened up over the La Salle Mountains in the distance. He'd passed a few other hikers, heading back early risers, finishing their treks, and exchanged polite nods. By 9 a.m., he was alone. He remembered stopping to photograph a cluster of desert paintbrush flowers at 10:15 because he'd noted the time in his journal. At 11:30, he'd eaten a granola bar on a flat rock overlooking a canyon. Then he'd continued deeper into the trail system, following a side path marked with a faded sign that read Gold Bar Rim 2.3 miles. That was the last normal memory he had. The first strange thing Nathan noticed was the footprints. His own. He'd been walking what felt like another mile when he rounded a bend and saw fresh tracks pressed into the soft red sand, the same tread pattern as his boots, the same gait, leading straight to a vertical rock face and stopping. No turnaround, no sidestep, just prints that walked into stone. Nathan stood there for a long moment, his heart doing something uncomfortable in his chest. He checked his phone. 247. He checked his watch. 247. The sun was directly overhead. No shadows. No angle to suggest time passing. He knelt and touched the sand beside the prints. It was cool, damp, as if someone had just stepped here moments ago. But the trail continued on the other side of the rock face. He could see it, 20 feet away, winding up a slope of crumbling shale. There was no way around. Nathan pressed his palm flat against the rock. It was warm from the sun, solid, real. He pushed. Nothing. He walked the length of the face, looking for a seam, a crack, any kind of passage. There was nothing, just solid Navajo sandstone. The same stone that had stood here for 200 million years. He thought about turning back. He should have turned back, but he'd been walking for hours, and the trail on the other side was right there, and the math didn't make sense. He stepped back, circled the rock face to the left, and found a narrow fissure he hadn't seen before. It was barely wide enough for his shoulders. A dark cut in the stone that seemed to go straight through. He couldn't remember seeing it a moment ago. He checked his phone again. 247. He pushed through. The fissure opened into a slot canyon, narrow and winding. The walls glowing with that deep orange light that photographers chase for hours. Nathan had been through slot canyons before they were common in this part of Utah. But this one felt different. The air was colder, for one thing, and utterly still. No breeze, no sound of birds or insects, just the soft crunch of his boots on sand that seemed too fine, almost powdery. He walked for what felt like 20 minutes, the walls curving and closing above him, until only a thin ribbon of sky was visible. The silence pressed against his ears. He started talking to himself, just to hear something. Okay, Slot Canyon probably connects back to the main trail. Nothing weird, but the walls were too smooth. No watermarks, no signs of flash flood debris. This canyon had never seen rain. The Slot Canyon opened into a circular clearing about 50 feet across. The walls rose sheer on all sides, leaning inward slightly, like the inside of a bell. The floor was perfectly flat stone, not a single grain of sand, not a crack, not a mark. Nathan stepped into the center and looked up. The sky was a perfect circle of blue, and the sun was directly overhead, casting no shadow. He checked his phone. 247. His reflection stared back at him from a dark pool of water. In the center of the clearing, a pool he hadn't noticed until he was standing right next to it. The water was black, perfectly still, and when he leaned over, his reflection didn't move in sync. It was half a second behind. Nathan jerked back from the pool. His heart slammed against his ribs. He looked down again. His reflection was his own now, moving with him, no delay. He blinked, told himself it was exhaustion, dehydration, the heat. He'd been hiking for hours, hours that hadn't passed. He knelt and dipped his hand into the water. It was cold, much colder than it should have been in the desert heat. He brought his wet fingers to his lips. The water tasted metallic, like old coins and rust. That was when he saw the other footprints leading into the pool, dozens of them overlapping from boots and shoes and bare feet, and none of them came back out. Think about this if you were standing at that pool right now and you saw those tracks. Would you have walked away, or would you have needed to know what was underneath? Nathan didn't walk away. He couldn't. The pull of the mystery was too strong, the same compulsion that had kept him reading forum threads until 3 a.m., that had driven him to book this trip alone, that Lisa had called unhealthy obsession. He took off his pack, sat down at the edge of the pool, lowered his legs into the water. The cold bit through his skin immediately. A deep ache that climbed up his thighs. He couldn't see the bottom. The water was too dark, too still, swallowing all light. He pushed off from the edge and let himself sink. The cold hit his chest, his neck, his face. He opened his eyes underwater and saw shapes. Not rocks, not fish. Shapes with angles that hurt to look at, moving slowly in the murk below. He kicked upward, broke the surface gasping, and found himself in darkness. The sky was black. The stars were out, but wrong constellations he didn't recognize, arranged in spirals that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on them. The walls of the clearing were the same, but the air had changed. It felt thin, cold, like high altitude, but without the pressure. Nathan hauled himself out of the pool, shivering violently, his clothes clinging to his skin. His phone was still in his pocket. He pulled it out. 2:47 p.m. The battery was at 100%, but the sun was gone. He checked his watch. 247. His compass spun slowly, aimlessly, like a dying insect. He was not in the same place. He was not sure he was on the same planet. He found an opening in the wall that hadn't been there before, a low archway leading into a tunnel. He crawled through it on his hands and knees, the stone rough and cold beneath his palms, and emerged onto a ledge overlooking a vast canyon. Below him, spread out across the desert floor, were lights, thousands of them, orange and flickering, like torches or campfires, arranged in streets and squares that mirrored a human city. But the buildings were wrong, too low, too organic, like they'd grown from the earth rather than been built. No sound rose from the city below. No wind, no voices, just absolute silence, so complete that Nathan could hear the blood moving through his own veins. He stood there for a long time, shivering, watching the lights pulse in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Something moved below, a figure, small against the scale of the city, walking along one of the winding streets. Nathan squinted, trying to make out details. The figure moved with an odd gait, too smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It stopped, turned, looked directly up at him. Nathan's breath caught. Even from this distance, he could see that its face was wrong too long. The features arranged in a way that almost looked human, but wasn't, like a portrait drawn by someone who had only heard. Nathan ran. He scrambled back through the archway, down the tunnel, his headlamp beam bouncing off walls that seemed to pulse and breathe. He couldn't hear his own footsteps, couldn't hear his own gasping breath. The silence had become a physical thing, pressing against his eardrums like cotton soaked in water. He burst out of the tunnel and found himself back in the slot canyon. But different, the walls were wet now, glistening with moisture that smelled like copper. He ran without thinking, without direction. His only goal to put distance between himself and that city, those lights, that pointing figure. The canyon twisted and turned, and he followed it blindly until he saw daylight ahead, real daylight, with proper shadows and warmth. Nathan stumbled out of the canyon into the late afternoon sun. Real sun, real shadows. He checked his phone, 5:34 p.m. The time was moving again. He nearly cried with relief. He was back on a familiar trail. He recognized the junction near the Gold Bar Rim turnoff. He walked quickly, not quite running, back toward the trailhead. The sky was gold and pink, the air warm, birds calling in the distance. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. But when he looked down at his own shadow, stretched long by the setting sun, he saw it move wrong. It lagged behind his steps by half a second, just like the reflection in the pool. He stopped. His shadow kept moving for 2 more steps, then stopped too. It was facing the wrong direction. Nathan stared at. Maya Chen's fingers hovered over the brass handle, cold as a corpse's touch. She'd been standing in front of room 7 for what felt like an hour. The silence pressing against her eardrums like water pressure at depth. The dusty spur motel had been abandoned since 1997. Every online forum, every crumbling road atlas, every local shed interviewed in Amboy, California, confirmed that fact. Yet here she stood, in the building's main corridor, and she could hear something breathing on the other side of that door. Not a draft, not the wind finding its way through decades of neglect. Breathing, slow, wet, rhythmic. Her assignment was simple document the decay of forgotten Route 66 landmarks for National Geographic's archives. 8 days of solitude, staring into the face of America's abandoned roadside dreams. But she hadn't accounted for what wakes up when the sun goes down in the Mojave Desert. The handle was cold, the breathing stopped, and then something on the other side tapped back. Maya had driven past the sign 3 times before she finally pulled over. The vacancy sign shouldn't have been light resource, Shed consulted. Confirmed the motel had been gutted of electricity 2 decades ago. But there it was, thin neon tubes bleeding orange into the desert dusk, casting long shadows across a parking lot that hadn't seen a vehicle since the Clinton administration. She killed the engine of her rented Ford Explorer and sat in the sudden quiet, watching the sign blink in a pattern that felt intentional, almost conversational. The Mojave does strange things to light at twilight. Dry air bends it, stretches it, makes distant things feel close, and close things feel distant. But this wasn't atmospheric refraction. This was a dead sign, drawing power from nowhere, inviting her inside. Her photographer's instinct screamed at her to document it. Her survival instinct, quieter but more insistent, told her to turn the key and leave this stretch of asphalt behind forever. 2 weeks earlier, Maya had been sitting in her cramped apartment in Portland, Oregon, scrolling through her portfolio with the uneasy feeling that her work had become predictable. 34 years old, freelance, specializing in architectural decay. Shed shot abandoned hospitals in New York, ghost towns in Montana, defunct theme parks in Florida. Each location offered the same story people left. Buildings stayed. Erosion claimed everything eventually. Her editor at National Geographic had offered her the Dusty Spur assignment as a favor. "It's been on our radar for years," he'd said over the phone, his voice crackling with the distance between coasts. But every photographer who goes out there comes back with either nothing useful or something unusable. "You're our last attempt." Maya had laughed at the time, assuming he meant the harsh desert conditions made for poor lighting. She hadn't asked what unusable meant. Her greatest flaw as a person and as an artist was the same: she couldn't leave a mystery unsolved. She needed to capture the thing that refused to be captured. The office door had been unlocked, which was the first thing that didn't sit right. Maya had expected to break in, to film herself picking a lock or climbing through a window. But the handle turned easily, and the hinges didn't even squeal. Inside, the dust was thick enough to draw patterns in, layered like snow that had never melted. She swept her flashlight across the front desk, across a rotary phone with a cracked receiver, across a coffee mug stained with something that had long since turned to powder. And then she found the register. It lay open to a page dated August 1997, the last month of the motel's operation. Names filled the ledger in various handsome rushed, some elegant, some childlike. She counted them, 42 signatures, 42 guests who had checked in during the motel's final month. Her flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, she noticed something that made the dry desert air feel suddenly cold against her neck. The last signature on the page was dated August 31st, 1997, but the ink looked fresh, still wet. She should have left then. Every instinct, every horror movie Shed ever watched, every story told around campfires in her childhood, all pointed to the same conclusion when the dead guest register shows fresh ink. You get in your car and you drive until the gas runs out. But Maya was a photographer. She needed the shot. She needed the story that no one else had managed to capture. So she walked deeper into the motel, her boots leaving prints in the undisturbed dust of the main corridor. The hallway stretched longer than the building's exterior suggested it should. 12 doors on each side, room 1 through room 24. Every third door was open a crack, and from each gap, a sliver of yellow light bled into the darkness. Not electric light, not natural light, something older, yellower, like the glow of a kerosene lamp or a candle burning tallow. She passed room 3, and the crack of light extinguished as she walked by. She passed room 6, and it did the same. By the time she reached room 9, the pattern was undeniable. The motel was watching her pass. Maya set up her tripod in the middle of the corridor, positioning her medium format camera to capture the full perspective of the vanishing point. She took 3 shots with different exposures. The mechanical click of the shutter, the only sound in the impossible silence. Then she remembered the Polaroid camera in her bagger backup, the one she used for test compositions before committing to film. She pulled it out, aimed down the hallway, and pressed the trigger. The camera whirred, ejected the photo, and she watched as the image developed in her palm. At first, it looked like any other photograph of an abandoned building, grainy, underexposed, full of shadows. But as the chemicals settled and the image resolved, she saw them. A family standing in the doorway of room 7. A man in his 40s, wearing a suit that looked 30 years out of style. A woman in a floral dress, her hair pinned up in a style Maya recognized from her grandmother's wedding photos. 2 children, a boy and a girl holding hands, their faces tilted toward the camera, but their features were wrong, stretched, elongated, like they were trying to smile through water. You shouldn't be taking pictures. Maya spun around, dropping the Polaroid. A man stood at the entrance to the corridor, silhouetted against the flickering vacancy sign. He was tall, thin, wearing a brown suit that had gone out of fashion before Maya was born. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but what she could see looked Ronghai's skin too pale, his eyes too dark, his features slightly out of alignment, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I'm a photographer. National Geographic." The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching her, his chest barely moving with breath. "This motel has been closed since 1997. Maya continued, filling the silence with words like a shield. "I have permits, permission from the county." The man took a step forward, and the distance between them closed faster than it should have. "You need to leave before you check in," he said. His voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, or from a great distance, or from inside her own skull. Maya's heel caught on a loose floorboard, and she stumbled backward, her camera bag swinging hard against her hip. The man in the brown suit made no move to approach her further, simply stood at the entrance, blocking the only path to the parking lot, to her car, to escape. "Check in," she repeated, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. "I don't understand." "Check into what?" The man tilted his head, and the motion was bird-like, unnatural. A joint moving in a direction joints weren't supposed to move. "The register," he said. "Everyone who signs the register checks in, and everyone who checks in stays." She felt her blood turn cold, a physical sensation like ice water being injected directly into her veins. The register, the fresh ink, the 42 names from August 1997. She looked down at her hands and saw that she was still holding the Polaroid, the family in the photographed man in the outdated suit, the woman with her grandmother's hairstylthy were still there, still staring at the camera, still smiling their stretched, water-distorted smiles. But now she noticed something she'd missed before. They weren't standing in front of room 7. They were standing in front of room 24. Her room. She hadn't told anyone which room she'd booked online through a historical preservation site. But somehow, the family in the photograph already knew. Maya ran, not toward the exit, where the man in the brown suit stood watching, but deeper into the motel, past the rooms with their slivers of yellow light, past the doors that opened a little wider as she passed. She burst through a door at the end of the corridor and found herself in the motel office. The register was still open on the desk, but the page had changed. It now showed a single entry dated today. The handwriting shaky and unfamiliar Maya Chen. Room 24, 3 nights. She hadn't written that. She hadn't touched the pen. But there it was, her name in looping cursive, the ink as fresh and wet as the summer rain that never fell in this part of the desert. Think about this if you found your name in a book you never wrote in a building you never should have entered. Would you try to erase it? Maya did. She grabbed the page, intending to tear it out. But the paper was smooth and intact, refusing to rip. She grabbed the pen, intending to scratch out her name. But the pen was dry, bone dry, empty. The ink in her name had come from nowhere, and she couldn't remove it. She locked herself in room 24. It was the only room with a working lock. The only room where the door closed properly. The only room that felt like it was waiting for her. The furniture was intact, a bed with a faded floral bedspread, a wooden nightstand with a ceramic lamp, a small bathroom with a mirror that had turned silver with age. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, her camera bag clutched to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. She took out her phone. No service. Of course, the desert swallowed signals the same way it swallowed sound. She tried her satellite phoneth backup shed brought for emergencies. Dead. Battery full, but dead. No signal, no dial tone, no connection to the world outside this building. The room was warm, but she was shivering. She looked at the bathroom mirror and saw her reflection staring back, her face pale, her eyes wide. But her reflection was moving wrong, a fraction of a second behind. And when she mouthed the words, "Get out," her reflection mouthed something else, something that looked like too late. She spent the next hour going through every photograph she'd taken that day. The Polaroids had developed fully now, and they told a story she couldn't rationalize away. The first few shots, taken outside the motel, showed nothing unusual, just a crumbling building against an empty sky. But the photos taken inside the corridor showed figures, more and more of them, as she got closer to room 24. A woman in 1950s clothing, standing by the ice machine. A man in military uniform from the 1940s, smoking a cigarette near the vending area. Children playing with a ball in the parking lot, their images washed out and pale, like they'd been exposed to light too long, and every single one of them was looking directly at the camera, looking at her. Maya fanned the photographs out on the bed and counted. 42 figures, 42 guests, exactly the number of names in the register. They had checked in, and they had never checked out. They had stayed, trapped between the living world and whatever comes after. Their images imprinted on the motel like stains that couldn't be scrubbed away. According to the register, she had joined them. The lock clicked at 2:47 a.m. Thank you for listening and spending part of your night here. If you enjoyed this narration, please leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And if you know someone who enjoys falling asleep to rain and dark stories, please share this with them. The rain will continue. Rest well.